At the Aspen Security Forum, and we have a great panel to start off with. Here to my immediate left, you're right, Matt Olsen, who became the director of the National Counterterrorism Center in August, and he, of course, now leads the integration and analysis of these groups. He worked for a while as the NSA General Counsel. He's been the acting head of the Department of Justice National Security Division. He was a special counsel of the FBI director. And most importantly, as he told me as we were waiting in that inevitable United Lounge last night, he spent a year in Denver, was that it? Yes. And up around this area as a lawyer. Right. Pursuing the young lady who became his wife. That's right. That's right. Okay. sounds like a good reason to be in Denver. Okay. Matt, of course, has told me that the day he came in, he had to completely remake all of the total mess that had been left by my good friend Michael Leiter, who, of course, ran the same center. Starting, I guess he ran it until last summer, 2011, and you had it for how many years?
I started there in 2007.
2007. He was deeply involved in some of the early efforts to pursue the clues on Osama bin Laden, and was also deeply involved in the red team that had to go establish to President Obama all of the arguments why the guy sitting in the compound might not be might not be Osama bin Laden, and he is now working as a national security analyst for NBC News and counselor to the CEO of Palantir Technologies. So I thought I would start the discussion by asking you folks about the center itself. It is now, 10 or 11 years since it was founded in the aftermath of, I'm sorry? 7 years since it was founded. In the aftermath of 9/11 and the restructuring of the intelligence community. We've had enough time to see how this concept of trying to integrate all of the different analytical elements works. And I'd be interested first just in your report card about what works and what doesn't. We'll start with you, Matt.
Sure. Well, thanks, David. And I wish I could say that the day I stepped in, the place was a shambles and it was a disaster. And everything over the last year, I've made it into this great place. But the truth is that when I walked in, NCTC was on a really solid footing. And more than that, it had really established itself as a vital part of the overall counterterrorism enterprise. And that in 7 years, Mike and I both corrected you as far as 7, because it really feels like it's still a very young organization. Some 7 years is is not a very long time in this business. And so I feel like in terms of a report card, that we are always sort of establishing ourselves, and we're still doing that, and we're still making it clear what we have to contribute and why we're this an important part of the CT effort. I guess I would mention a couple things, and these are things really, and I've been asked Mike to turn over to Mike, but I mean these are things that were identified from the beginning of the National Counterterrorism Center and TTIC before it as the two key things I think that we bring to the fight, and one is the integration of information. So we bring all the information on CT together in one place, and that sounds like obviously one might think that's of course that's the right thing to do, but it's a lot harder to actually pull that off than it sounds, and it's something we're still working toward, but much of the work to do that has been done, integrating all of the CT information, whether it's collected overseas or inside the United States, in one place. And the second thing is really integrating the people and having individual intelligence officials, professionals, analysts, planners from around the government and particularly around the CT community all working in one place. So we have people from DIA, CIA, FBI, State Department, DHS, all coming together in one center and bringing those perspectives and experiences to bear on this one problem. And so those were the animating ideas, I think, behind NCTC from the beginning, and they've really borne fruit. Although, again, we're still a bit of a startup, I feel, and still having to prove ourselves.
Let me ask you a quick question on the culture of the startup, and then we'll ask Mike to follow up on this. One of the concerns when this all began was that the individuals who were sitting there would all be in this group, but they will have grown up in the culture of the agency that sent them, whether it was the CIA or the DIA or Justice or wherever. And that in the end, you would have a group that got along well within themselves, but weren't really able to solve the silo problem. Tell us about that.
So on that point, I think we really have achieved that culture. So an NCTC culture, and that was in place when I arrived. Tribute to Mike and to Admiral Red and John Brennan, who established that as a culture so that people left behind their more parochial perspectives and adopted a culture of collaboration and partnership. There's this great picture that I've seen from the early days of NCTC with someone's desk, and underneath that desk are about, no kidding, 8 or 9 different central processing units, all different computers from different agencies brought into one place, and all these pipes, and that is no longer the case. So I think that's actually emblematic of a culture that we now have. You may have a couple of systems at a workplace, but we're not bringing a number of different sort of silos into one place and then calling that a fusion center. So I think that has largely been achieved.
Mike, what works? What do you think when you left needed to be done?
Well, first of all, I think the audience, I hope, already sees how easy it is to step down from a job like this when you have someone like Matt Olsen who's going to take over and take such good care of the center and improve it. Amazing eloquence, experience, and intellectual heft to do this job brilliantly. So I'm really happy how good a hand NCTC is in. I do want to correct something Clark said, because I think it's actually an exaggeration and unfair to much of the rest of the intelligence and homeland security community, which is that no organization has been more central to stopping a 9/11 than NCTC. I think NCTC is really important. I'd like to think of it as probably one of the, if not the most successful developments post 9/11 in U.S. government intelligence. But if you know anything about the government, it's really big. And there are so many different pieces of it. And NCTC, I think, plays a critical role in that process and has helped. But without every other piece of that government, intelligence, counterterrorism community working together, nothing gets stopped. And that was true with bin Laden, where NCTC had a small niche element, but other people worked on. It's true in stopping other attacks in New York or elsewhere. It is still the hard work of the FBI and DHS and DOD and CIA that provides that data and information for NCTC to paint a mosaic of, but there are a lot of people who have bought the paint in the first place.
Can I just say, in Clark's defense, I noticed that the program actually says no agency created after 9/11, with the exception of perhaps DHS, has done as much. So, and I'm not sure what other organizations that would actually be, other than NCTC and DHS. I don't know, but
parsed like a good lawyer. I'll actually.
But I agree with that point.
I'll now try to answer David's question. And I think Matt actually captured it very well. NCTC has become a great place where information people come together. And the idea that people come from different organizations and either become too NCTC, or many of the fears were that they would stay too much like they were from their home agency. I do think NCTC has actually got the sweet spot there. We talk about stovepipes of information and intelligence as an inherently negative thing, which in some ways it is, but it's also developing unique experience and expertise about that line of work, whether it's working at Treasury or NSA on signals intelligence, and that's incredibly valuable. And what NCTC, I think, has successfully done is taken that expertise that people have from throughout the intelligence community, put them all in one place, apply that same expertise to other people's information. So it's great when you get one of Keith Alexander's SIGINTers sitting at NCTC, now looking at Sean Joyce's and Bob Mueller's FBI information and saying, wait, there's something else here that we could use or do something with. And before there was an NCTC, there was no place for that to happen. And I think NCTC has done a really important, and it serves a really important role. The second role, which I think NCTC is trying to serve, but there's still a lot of growth to be done, and that's as much my fault, more my fault than Matt's, is the policy role that NCTC serves. We focus on intelligence, but NCTC has a policy coordination role, strategic operational planning in the statute. But basically, once you have that policy from the White House, how is the entire interagency going to go pursue those goals? And that's really more nascent, and that shouldn't be surprising because that's pretty revolutionary for the U.S. government. And we've made some progress there, but I still think that that is a place where the U.S. government writ large and NCTC more specifically has room to grow.
Matt, about once every 2 weeks or so, you go over to the White House, down into the Situation Room, you meet the President, many of the NSC principals, and you run through the current level of threats, the sort of summation of your reporting in the past 2 weeks. Can you describe to us a little bit about how you prepare that information, what level of detail the President and his top aides get? And then, Mike, if you can compare this a little bit to what happened in the earlier days of the Obama administration, and then, most importantly, to the Bush administration, because President Bush famously would have that threat matrix that he would get briefed on every day, and that's changed a bit. So I'm going to start with you, Matt.
Sure. As David said, so about every couple weeks, sometimes more often, sometimes less, there's a session focused on counterterrorism and the homeland in particular, and with the President and with the national security team. The role that I inherited, that Mike and others established for NCTC, was that we are the organization that supplies the sort of overview of the intelligence picture. It's a relatively high level sort of rundown of where the key threats are coming from, whether they're Pakistan or from Yemen or Somalia or inside the United States. And as you can imagine and appreciate, that I don't have 45 minutes to do that. I do that in about 10 minutes or less. But the idea then is, and the way the meeting is handled, is that we go around after I provide that overview, and others, the operational side, the agencies that Mike identified, CIA, FBI, DHS, State Department, the military, talk about what we're doing in response to that threat. It's actually a great role for NCTC in terms of preparing. I prepare a lot for that, as you can imagine, and I think it's the one thing I would identify as an aspect of NCTC that I think is maybe a little different from the rest of the intelligence community, just given our size. We're pretty small, so I have a meeting before that session and other similar meetings at the White House with analysts, and there have been many occasions where I'll have a question, and an analyst who looks to me like they're about 20, they're maybe 30, but they look quite young, and they'll say, I have a question about this particular threat. I'm leaving in 15 minutes to go to the White House, and they will run it down, give me an answer, and it pretty much goes from that analyst who's right out of grad school to me, to the President. And I think that is a pretty rewarding thing for that analyst to experience. And we typically will do a readout right after that session to say, okay, here were the issues. I have an opportunity to thank folks, but I can also give feedback. That piece of information you gave me, that was, I briefed that an hour ago.
Not that puts any pressure on the analysts at all about getting it wrong.
You better get it right. Yeah.
I also just want to point out I have been relegated to being Matt's water boy, which is just fine.
Thank you.
This is what happens when you leave government, Matt.
Right. It's just fine. If only. So what Matt described was very similar to what we did in both the Bush administration and the beginning of the Obama administration. We joked last night, I always went every week, but Matt's doing okay anyway. And one of the nice things was we had a session actually during the transition of the two administrations where people, I know Denny Blair, I'm sure remembers this, where we had the incoming and outgoing for each senior national security position in an exercise. And Rahm Emanuel grabbed Denny, I hope this isn't too apocryphal, who's the DNI, and grabbed us and said, we are absolutely doing those Tuesday sessions, we are keeping this going, we're keeping the focus on terrorism. So, that was heartening to, I think, the people who were holdovers to hear that the administration was going to stay very, very focused on it. A couple of little things did change between the two administrations. President Bush was a morning guy, so we started at 8 a.m., and if you were there at 8:01, where sometimes that happened, it didn't matter. We just started without you, and I think Mike Hayden and Mike Chertoff will testify to that. So we did the morning session, and it was honestly, it was actually a little smaller group in the Bush administration, and I think that was both good and bad. It included really only the intelligence people and NCTC. It didn't include, actually I should say, it included the Attorney General and FBI and DHS, so it was focused on the homeland. But what we didn't have was we didn't have DOD there, we didn't have the State Department there, we didn't have Treasury there. So it was a little bit more intimate, and in some ways that made the conversation a little bit more robust, I think. But you always missed that one piece because you didn't have some key policy organizations there in the morning. The Obama administration made a change to make it a little larger, and I think with that, bringing in those other elements, bringing in the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense and State, Secretary of Treasury, that helped paint a more complete terrorism picture, because I think it is difficult to simply separate out the homeland when you're talking about terrorism. Inevitably, you're talking about lots of things in lots of places in the world. The only other thing I would note, which was implicit in what Matt said, but I think is critical for NCTC's role, is that in giving that initial brief and laying out the strategic level threat assessment, what you're doing is you're setting the agenda for what's important in terrorism. And NCTC, again, might not be the most central player in any of these events or threats that you're talking about. But by setting the agenda, frankly, you're forcing the other operational elements to talk about it in front of the president. And that's actually a very, very powerful tool, both for ensuring that that information is being shared and ensuring that those operational elements are truly focused on it if NCTC thinks it's an important threat.
Let's turn to a couple of places that are particular challenges to you now, and which I'm sure you're taking up when you do those once every 2 week or so meetings. Let's start with Syria, because it's been most in the news. We saw some fascinating video about a day or two ago that showed a faction of the Syrian rebels with what looked like an AQ flag behind them. We've seen AQ have some revival in Iraq. There was this awful attack a few days ago that killed nearly 100 people or so. There's some suggestion that if there are AQ elements in Syria, that they may just be bleeding over from Iraq. In other words, that it may not be homegrown. What can you tell us about what we know about AQ's operations in Syria and whether it's a serious part of this rebellion?
Sure. I take it you're asking that question of me. And
yeah, well,
right? So, obviously Syria is a place that we're spending a lot of time, a lot of folks looking at very carefully, and that includes the CT piece of that, but CT is just one part of it, and really not the main the main part. It's obviously the issues in Syria are much broader, and but I would say the couple things that we're most concerned about from a counterterrorism perspective. One is the issue that you raised, David. So we're looking at the status of al-Qaeda in Iraq. Obviously, the attacks, over 100 people killed in a series of coordinated attacks over the weekend, a series of car bombings and suicide attacks. We're watching the level of violence in Iraq and are concerned about the border between Syria and Iraq and the possibility that individuals associated with al-Qaeda in Iraq could move in into Syria and then take advantage of the unrest there. It's a difficult picture because of the nature of the opposition in Syria. It presents a real difficult intelligence challenge for us. So, but it is clearly one of the things that we're very focused on, is trying to figure out at what level, if at all, Syria, Iraq, al-Qaeda in Iraq is present in Syria. That's one. The other area, though, of real concern, and this is no different in Syria than it is in Libya and other places that have experienced significant changes through the Arab Spring over the last couple of years, and that is the status of weapons, the regime's weapons, whether conventional or unconventional. And obviously the concern there for us is the possibility that those weapons, sophisticated weapons, could fall into the hands of terrorists. So that's the other significant concern about Syria.
Let's pursue that one for just a moment. And obviously, the Syrians have significant stores of chemical weapons, and there's some discussion of biological weapons. Just the other day, they said they wouldn't use them against their own people, but they might use them against an outside invader. What do we think the actual status of them is right now? They have been moved from their original storage places. Do we have a good sense of what the chain of command is, of control over them?
So again, as you point out, the Syrian regime acknowledged having these weapons recently,
which they've never before acknowledged, to my mind.
There was a public acknowledgement of that. So the key for us is following those questions that you identified. How are we able to identify where those weapons are? Are they safe? Are they secure? Are they falling into the wrong hands? So it's an important question for us.
Have you got any preliminary conclusions on that?
No, not really. Again, this is a very sensitive time in this situation. So it's an important question that we're following.
Okay. Let me ask you, Mike, as you look out at the totality of al-Qaeda these days, al-Qaeda Central, as we all know, is in particularly tough shape these days. It doesn't look like it's getting any better. I'd be interested in your assessment of that, but also your assessment of whether or not these offshoots, including al-Qaeda in Iraq, would have the capability, as I think an al-Qaeda in Iraq leader made the suggestion last weekend, that they could try to strike back at the United States from that base. It'd be the ultimate irony if ultimately there was a strike against the United States from Iraq, a country that we ended up sending forces into a year and a half after 9/11. What's your sense of this?
I think overall, I mean, you've obviously identified a couple of places which are very difficult, and they're difficult, as Matt said, not just for counterterrorism purposes, but broader national security interests. These are very complicated places, and whether it's Syria or Libya or Egypt, we face some real challenges with governments forming and the evolution of democracy or some form thereof. I think on Iraq, the state of al-Qaeda broadly, the fact is we're actually doing really well. Al-Qaeda in Pakistan and Afghanistan it's not fair to say they've been decimated, and every U.S. government official who's smart and wants to keep their job never will say that the threat is gone, because it's not. But in reality, what has happened, what we have done to al-Qaeda in Pakistan is really nothing short of tremendous gains, where it's not impossible, but it's very difficult in my assessment for al-Qaeda in Pakistan to launch a sophisticated attack outside of its borders in Pakistan. Not impossible, but very, very difficult. We have significantly reduced the likelihood of another 9/11 emanating from Pakistan. There's the good news. Plenty of bad news in Pakistan that we don't have to talk about, the government and other cooperation with the U.S., but al-Qaeda core, huge gains. You look at a place like Yemen. Yemen has obviously continued to be a sore spot. Whether or not President Hadi is going to be able to actually exert a writ of government across all elements of Yemen, so you don't have safe havens to launch attacks from there, that's still an open question. And Iraq is going to be in the exact same place. The fact is, we're going to have terrorists in all these places. The question is whether these terrorists have either the intent or the capability to launch an attack against the United States or our close allies over the next several years. My assessment of Iraq is I hope that Iraq is wise and allows us to continue to operate in conjunction with the Iraqi forces to ensure that they don't have a safe haven to attack the West, even though undoubtedly they're going to face continued attacks in Iraq for the foreseeable future.
And Matt, how would you say that cooperation's been? Obviously, all the American troops are out of Iraq, but presumably there's still significant cooperation underway. How's that working out as a practical matter?
I think the cooperation there is good. I think there's room for improvement, but I think there's been good cooperation with Iraq. I think Mike hit it on the head in talking about we face sort of a similar set of issues across the board. And you can look at Egypt or Yemen Iraq, Pakistan, and each of these places presents its own challenges in terms of our level of cooperation, as well as sort of the capabilities in those countries to provide security. And just to take a point up from where Mike left off, it's interesting to me to hear Mike and others talk about the state of whether it's al-Qaeda core or AQAP, and how much what folks on the outside say and how much it tracks with what we say in classified settings on the inside of government.
Because they're leaking to us. I want to
to be clear, that's not. And I had the opportunity to participate in a panel conference last week with Peter Bergen, Stephen Cole, Phil Mudd, others were there, and I made the point, I think, that when it comes to sort of the strategic level analysis and assessment that's going on, putting aside sort of operational issues and sources and methods, that the serious work that's going on outside of government is really important. It's important to us inside government because there's so much good thinking going on outside, and it's reflected in I think that the assessment that Mike just gave really lines up with ours inside the government.
Mike, you raised Pakistan. I wanted to ask both of you about that. In Confront and Conceal, I describe a 2009 incident. I think, Mike, you were still in at that time, in which there was a brief concern early in the Obama administration that the Taliban might have gotten a hold of either nuclear material or the makings of a weapon. And it turned out, fortunately, to be a false alarm. But it also focused people's attention quite dramatically on the internal threat within Pakistan. And of course, the biggest concern was not that weapon would necessarily make its way to the United States, though that's always a concern, but that it could be used just within Pakistan or within the region. So as you look now at an expanding Pakistani nuclear arsenal, the fastest expanding arsenal in the world, and you hear the constant reassurances from the Pakistanis, don't worry, we've got this under control, but then incidents like this that give you pause. What do you think the current state of play is? Is there something we're not doing, we can be doing? Is the relationship with Pakistan now so fraught that we can't even take the subject up with them very much at all? Post bin Laden.
Well, I mean, I think you are. I think Clark is doing a panel just on Pakistan, and I would largely defer to the people who know the country better than I, and people like Vice Admiral Mike Lefevre, who spent 3 years as senior defense attaché in Pakistan, and now is very appropriately one of Matt's deputies at the National Counterterrorism Center.
Don't worry, we're getting to Matt next with this question.
No, but listen, just that point is critical. That's a role that NCTC serves, that you have someone from the military who has a career experience in the U.S. Navy, spends 3 years as our government's defense expert in Pakistan, and he comes back and he brings that expert knowledge and experience back to the National Counterterrorism Center now to shape broader U.S. government policy. I mean, that's how the system should work, and it is working in that regard. To your question about Pakistan, listen, it is a tough relationship. I think Mike Lefevre would be the first to admit that. We simply, in my view, the U.S. and Pakistan, our strategic goals simply don't align perfectly, which means you're going to have lots of instances where there's incredible tension about what the government will look like in Afghanistan, what their Pakistani involvement will be, what Indian involvement may be, what the Pakistani-Indian relationship will be. If you look at what the U.S. government wants in the region and what the government of Pakistan wants in the region, they're not perfectly aligned, and we can't get them perfectly aligned easily. So you have a series of tensions, whether that is post-bin Laden, ground lines of communication into Afghanistan, or countless other pieces. I want to correct one other thing you said, though, David. I haven't read your book. I told you this last night. I apologize.
You're forgiven.
Thank you. No one sent me a free copy. So. I actually, and without confirming the piece about a nuclear weapon in Pakistan, I would analogize it also to Abdul Muttalib. I think the Obama administration came in with absolutely 100% as serious a focus on terrorism in Pakistan than the Bush administration had, and that was 100% focused. I think the difference, whether it's the without confirming what you wrote, but that piece or the underwear bomber in 2009, what it did was just make some in the administration feel that threat a little bit more in their gut. And it wasn't that they weren't focused on it before. It's one thing when you're on the outside looking in, and it's another thing when you're now driving the bus and these things are happening to you in your administration. They were focused all the time, but as I've said, everyone kind of tightened the straps on their rucksack a little bit more, and it made it more real. So I don't think that incident or any other incident vastly changed this administration's focus. It simply intensified that focus a little bit.
Matt, when you came in, this was probably among the first times you really had to focus on all of the range of threats in Pakistan, not only nuclear, but of course, Haqqani network, right. All of the various elements. What strikes you now, a year into the job, about the complexity of the various threats emanating from there?
I would say, and I would also point to Mike Lefevre, who's here today, as somebody I can now have the opportunity to turn to as an expert on these issues, and it's terrific to have him there. But I think it's that I was very focused on CT from prior positions I've held, and then to come into my job as a CT person and realize the issues with Pakistan are so much broader than counterterrorism, and CT is a slice of the problem, but it's the range of military, diplomatic, political challenges there go far beyond CT. CT is very important, and we spend a lot of time talking about the specific issues, whether it's groups like the militant groups like the Haqqanis and others, GLOCs that you mentioned, but these really are sort of specific issues that are part of a much broader strategic relationship.
Mm-hmm. And how much does the expansion of the nuclear arsenal concern you as you just look at the totality of what's bubbling away still inside Pakistan? In this particular case, the concern was a faction of the Taliban, but the next time it could be some other group, right. And it may not be nuclear; it could be some other issue. But
I guess I would answer that question by talking about something we're doing now at NCTC, and that is, as you may know, so part of the ODNI there's also a National Counterproliferation Center, and so NCTC and NCPC have partnered to create an integration center, integration group, and the idea is to really make sure that we're covering the seam between proliferation and terrorism when it comes to WMD. It's something that's really important that we are, they're covering the proliferation side, we're covering the terrorism side, and that there's no gap between us. And so that's a very focused on...
That's a group that has got people from both your group and from the proliferation
Exactly,
center.
Reporting both to myself and to the head of the National Counterproliferation Center, and we meet regularly, and it's basically an integration cell, and it's really an important. I think one of the few things actually I've done since you've left that sort of builds on the concept of NCTC.
Yeah. That's great, David. I would say the Bush administration into the Obama administration, enormous focus by the Department of Energy and other elements of the U.S. government working with the Pakistanis to help make sure that their nuclear arsenal is secure. There are lots of different ways to do that. I'm not an expert on it, but it involves personal security, technology, guards, movement of materials, and the like. That's been a really intense area for the U.S. government. And the fact is, whenever you have militants within a country that has nuclear arms launching pretty sophisticated terrorist attacks, not on nuclear facilities, but on armed forces facilities, of course we have to be very concerned about this. And it is also the reason that regardless of how south the relationship goes at times, we can't let the relationship completely fracture. You can't allow the U.S. not to have constant running and, you hope, honest dialogue with a country that has a significant nuclear arsenal and has factions within that country which are clearly opposed to U.S. national security interests.
And you're focused, I assume, a lot, including in that new integration center, on the insider threats within the government.
That's right.
And you assess those now as less or greater than they were a few years ago? Okay. We'll move on to something easy, Iran. Okay. So we have seen in the past in the past year, the beginnings of some charges that Iran is trying to strike outside of its borders. And most famously, there was this case last year brought by the Department of Justice claiming that there had been an assassination plan against the Saudi ambassador to the United States. But there have been other incidents around the world attributed either to Quds Force, to Hezbollah, or others, where people have made allegations of Iranian connections, including the Israelis claiming an Iranian connection to the bombing very tragic bombing just last week. Are you seeing evidence at this point that Iran has a coordinated effort or an uncoordinated effort to be able to strike well beyond its borders?
I mean, I would say that both with respect to Iran as well as Hezbollah, we're seeing a general uptick in the level of activity around the world in a number of places. So it's certainly, both Hezbollah and the Quds Force have demonstrated an ability to operate, essentially globally. And I think that the case involving the attempt to assassinate the Saudi ambassador to the United States, individuals named Arbab Siar, and there's another individual who are pending trial in New York for that. That demonstrated that Iran actually had the intent to, or their willingness to carry out an attack, a terrorist attack inside the United States. So those are significant developments from our perspective. And so as you look at, on one hand, the Sunni groups that, al-Qaeda groups and al-Qaeda affiliated groups that we're concerned about. Also, there are times when, at the top of the list, when we are briefing at the White House, are Hezbollah or Iran and their activities in various parts around the world.
Mm-hmm. Mike, have you seen this evolve in a particularly different way since when you left a year ago?
I think what has been a relatively hot war has gotten hotter. We can't forget that Iran and Hezbollah actively targeted U.S. service members in Iraq and Afghanistan for many years. Iranian-produced IEDs led to the death of U.S. soldiers throughout Iraq. So the Iranians have considered this a shooting war for some time. I think the Israelis, to some extent, have thought the same. And I do think over the past year, we've seen an uptick in the intensity of the activity. And we are reaching, I think, I'm not sure if we're reaching a climax. I think that's hard to say. But I think we have already entered a very dangerous time. Clearly with the tension over Iran's nuclear ambitions, combined with the targeting of the death of scientists and the activities in Bulgaria, this is a period where I think the U.S. and our allies have to remain very aware of the risk of Iranian/Hezbollah, and they're not the same, but they're intricately tied together in many ways, not perfectly, but in many ways, for a continued violence in the future. It's a real challenge, and I see David Cohen from Treasury sitting in front of us. There are lots of tools we have to use against this. It's not like al-Qaeda. The financial sanctions and the like against Hezbollah and Iran are critical to showing that there really is no room for them to operate using terrorism.
And Matt, just thinking out ahead in the future here, let's say that the fracturing in Syria continues and that either the Assad government falls or is in control of less of the country. How does that change the picture as you look at it for Iran? And this is obviously their only real friend in the region.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends completely on what happens following Assad and the nature of what replaces that regime. But obviously there's a close connection between the Assad regime, Iran, and Hezbollah. So the question is what comes next when inevitably something does happen there in terms of a change. So that question really just is very contingent on the facts of what develop.
And have you developed various scenarios already? Some in which Syria could become a haven for more of this activity, some in which it may not, or is it something that there's really no utility in trying to predict?
No, there definitely is utility in thinking ahead and trying to figure out what the different scenarios might present from a U.S. perspective. Again, counterterrorism is an important, but a piece of this broader national security challenge for us there.
Well, we want to open this up to questions in the audience. We have some microphones that are around. Please make sure that your questions are really a question. For colleagues of these gentlemen who are in the U.S. government, this is the opportunity to ask that question in the open that you'd much rather see how they squirm rather than when they're in a private meeting. But we'll start with the gentleman right here, and if you just wait for a microphone.
Yes, Guy Swan from the Association of the U.S. Army, and I know Mike very well. Both of you, I want to compliment you and your predecessors on what NCTC has accomplished. I think on Matt's watch, with the impending election, regardless of how it turns out, we'll reach a point where we need to review the future of the National Counterterrorism Center. And you've talked about a lot of history here, but I'd like to hear about where both of you think this great accomplishment needs to go in the future.
Sure. It's a question we think about a lot, and I think Mike identified there are a few challenges, and I would pick a couple. One is our planning role and making sure that we're fulfilling that fully. I think the statute set out a level of responsibility that for NCTC in terms of all of government planning on counterterrorism that we're still working toward. And there we're working very closely with the White House and as a sort of as an extension of the national security staff, picking up issues and working through those in a number of areas. So that's one challenge. I would say another challenge, and I suspect Mike would agree, is as we collect more and more information, more and more data about terrorism, whether that's, there's a whole range of ways in which we collect that information, and we bring it together in one place. And I talked about integrating that data. The question is, how do we then make sure that we expose that data to analysts effectively and give them the tools to make sense of that data? I think something that I think is pretty obvious to folks in this room is that if there's another attack or if there's a threat, the likelihood is that you could look back retrospectively and find some hint or some clue in the vast amount of data that we have access to. The real challenge for us is ahead of that attack, ahead of that threat, to make sure that analysts have the ability to see it, make that connection, and then provide the lead to the FBI or to the CIA to stop it.
I couldn't agree with Matt more on that piece, and it is something which is unfortunately often lost, sometimes in the press, sometimes to the public, often to congressional investigators, how easy it is to piece things together after you know what already happened versus before something has happened. I'd offer a couple of other future thoughts, and Matt may or may not agree. The budget's going to shrink for everybody. The budget should shrink for everybody. After a really big input of dollars from the U.S. people over the past 11 years, counterterrorism and all of national security is going to at least flatline, if not go down. And in that regard, what happens to NCTC? But more importantly, what happens to the rest of the counterterrorism constellation around NCTC? It was, in some ways, easy to build NCTC when nothing else went away in the U.S. government over the past 11 years. And that's largely what has happened. As we go forward and those budgets change, I think NCTC, because it works as well as it does, needs to stay there and needs to stay central. But what parts of the rest of the system can you start to diminish and have NCTC take on that role? The U.S. government is a heck of a lot better at building things up than it is breaking things down. I think that the second challenge for NCTC will be as the public's focus on terrorism drops, I think appropriately so, based in part on what we've been talking about. Not that it stopped the threat, but that the threat has changed since 9/11 for the good. How do you keep the focus of the people and the important investments that you have to make for those people remain in a good place? And Matt and I like people say, thanks so much for doing your job. I had, and Matt has, a relatively easy job. We might get in trouble if something goes wrong, but it's really easy, guys, to run an organization where you've got 1,100 people or so who every day they come in, they see remnants of the World Trade Center, they see remnants of the Pentagon, and they know exactly why they're there at work. They are there to stop innocent people getting killed from terrorists. You don't need to give any motivational speeches. They are there. And as that awareness in the public and the focus on terrorism starts to diminish, how do you maintain the focus of the workforce in the same really critical way?
Doug?
Hi, I'm Doug Fife from the Hudson Institute. Compliments to both of you for what you've accomplished with NCTC. There was some reference to the plot to blow up the restaurant in Washington, D.C., targeting the Saudi ambassador. And the administration came out very strongly when that happened and said that the blame belonged to the Iranian government. And I'm just wondering, what have we done to penalize the Iranian government for a really outrageous plot? I mean, they were talking about killing, perhaps 100 people or so in a restaurant. I mean, it could have been more on American soil. In fact, in our capital. And what have we done regarding Iran that would say to the Iranian government that, particularly because of this problem, as opposed to all the other problems we have with Iran, particularly because of this, they have paid a price?
Matt?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, much of what much of what we've done in terms of responding, I can't talk about here. And you know as well as I, sort of what's been done, sort of publicly, working through the UN and other organizations. But I think going back to what Mike said before, we need to recognize that the situation with Iran is extremely complicated, and I'm not saying anything newsworthy to say that it's escalating the tensions there. Whether Iran is feeling, with scientists being killed, sanctions, the oppressive sanctions, feeling that this conflict is tending to escalate. So it creates a really complicated situation. So as well as everyone else here, sort of the nature of what's been done publicly, and then there's a number of things that obviously I can't talk about.
Okay. Gentleman here.
Thank you. Steve Shapiro from New York. I am working with Ben's business executives for national security on domestic intelligence issues, and we've had a chance to talk to Mike about this at great length. And Matt, you're on our target list, and perhaps we can get you up after we meet today. But for public discussion, NCTC does have a domestic intelligence role. If there's a nexus between the foreign and the domestic activity, NCTC can go. And NCTC, as I understand it, has been tasked by NSC with respect to certain other issues, such as domestic radicalism.
Right.
So, domestic extremism. So there is an NCTC domestic role. And I'm curious about how you see the landscape on the domestic intelligence side. The foreign intelligence side is very clear, very effective, not too many organizations at work. The domestic intelligence side, of course, you've got NCTC working, you've got 96 JTTFs, 77 fusion centers, 56 FIGs, 12 new OD&I representatives. It almost sounds like a Christmas carol here. So a partridge in a pear tree coming next. So how do you see that landscape? Do you see a congruence of these multiple grids, or are they confusing? Are they helpful? Should they be streamlined? Can they be, et cetera?
Let's ask you to take that up. We've only got 6 or 7 minutes.
Yeah.
We want to try to
I
get
can do
to
a quick response. I mean, you know this issue, and this is, and you've hit the nail on the head. We've got a very complicated picture of the domestic architecture for counterterrorism, with the number of fusion centers, the JTTFs. I mean, I think that, and this is something that really began, I think, under Mike's leadership, and that is for NCTC to focus increasingly on our sort of domestic posture. And we've done a number of things. For us, I do think we have a key role, and it's because we sit right at the intersection of the foreign intelligence and domestic architecture for counterterrorism. So we have all that data coming from overseas. We have the data coming from the intelligence coming from inside the United States. So we really build on top of that. We have our own set of domestic representatives out in field offices, working with the DNI reps, working with JTTFs. We have detailees that come from state and local police departments and fire departments who work at NCTC and get a seat at the national intelligence table with us. We provide situational awareness to a number of state and local police departments. So, I mean, I think there's a need going forward to, taking your point, streamline this a bit and clarify, because you will talk to a police chief or somebody or a fire chief, and they may say this is confusing to us, and we need to try to work on clarifying it. And there's a number of leaders from DHS and FBI here, and they really have the lead role for this. But we support it really through our intelligence.
See, I think we have a long way to go here. It's not to say that the FBI hasn't come an enormous way over the past 11 years in becoming more of an intelligence organization. It's not that DHS does not do incredible intelligence collection through organizations like CBP and then analysis. But we built up a lot of stuff. State and local fusion centers financially are not going to be sustainable into the future with the current budgets. How do they link to the JTTFs? How effectively do we create a nationwide web? The fact is, we're doing pretty well because radicalization has not been an enormous concern, but it hasn't manifested itself here. And that's because of traditions in the U.S. and good work of people in the intelligence community. But this is an area, going back to Guy's question, where over the next several years, we're going to have to do a little bit better. And one piece I would add there, we still unfortunately have not had either a director of national intelligence or a principal deputy director of national intelligence who has any significant professional experience in the domestic intelligence and law enforcement realm. If we're serious about this, that was part of the goal of the DNI, to merge the worlds of foreign and domestic intelligence. We've got to change that in the coming years.
We're going to do a lightning round where I'm going to just take 2 or 3 questions and then parse them out because we only have 5 more minutes. So we'll start with this gentleman and then right back there. Yeah.
Gilles Lecercourt, I'm the European Union Counterterrorism Coordinator. Hi, Mike. Hi.
How are you?
You mentioned a lot of threat coming from Pakistan, from Yemen, from Iran, and so forth, but I haven't heard anything about Africa, and there are quite worrying development in Africa. Northern Mali is slowly transforming into a safe haven, which might attract more and more foreign fighters. Boko Haram in Nigeria has hated more and more, and we have the transformation of al-Shabaab into al-Qaeda in East Africa. The concern I have is to see the 3 organizations, AQIM, AQEA, and Boko Haram linking up in a more structured way. Okay, is it not a threat for you, or is it below your radar?
Good. So we've got an Africa question, and then back here.
Thank you. Daniel Stewart from Naval Special Warfare Command. Commander, U.S. SOCOM has expanded its interagency presence up in the National Capital Region. And I would be interested, based on budget and other things you've already discussed, how you see your relationship, NCTC's relationship, with that budding group going forward. Thank you.
Okay, so who wants to do Africa? You want to start with that, man?
Sure. I mean, Gilles, it is certainly right at the top of our list. Exactly the way you described: Al-Shabaab, AQIM, Boko Haram. Groups right now that tend to be very regionally focused. So focused in Nigeria, Mali, Somalia, but very concerned about the possibility that places like Mali, places like Somalia provide a safe haven for conducting attacks either against U.S. Western interests in the region or possibly, back here in the United States. So just by virtue of time, I don't think we touched on it to give it sort of the treatment that it deserves and the amount of time that we devote to it at NCTC.
I would agree. I have to say publicly, because I never thought I would in my lifetime, Somalia, actually, there's some positive signs. Yeah. So that's positive. I do think Nigeria, very big problem we've seen for years. If you look at the polling of support for al-Qaeda, bin Laden, and suicide attacks in Nigeria, it's been very bad for many years. We're seeing that manifestation, and Nigeria is central to many interests. We've got to guard it. SOCOM and JSOC, I have to tell you that Bill McRaven and Eric Olsen we couldn't have better friends at NCTC. The relationship has been stellar. They have been unbelievably open. I know Matt and I have both traveled with Bill McRaven and Joe Votel, the new commander of JSOC. They're quiet in what they do outside in the world, but they are unbelievably open to the National Counterterrorism Center, and the planning relationship, in my experience, has been stellar under both Eric and now Bill.
Yeah, let me just say I totally agree with that. It's a really strong relationship and partnership with JSOC and NCTC and SOCOM on the planning side. So and that's a place I think we'll continue to foster that strong partnership going forward.
Matt, I just wanted to follow up very quickly on something that Mike said there, which is there actually is some hope in Somalia. And I don't think 3 years ago, if any of us had been asked to bet a beer on this question, you would have been willing to risk it. Tell us why you think that. What's come together there? What are we to learn?
Well, really, there's been some gains by the Ethiopians and the Kenyans militarily against al-Shabaab that have put a lot of pressure on the safe haven. And really required, and there's even leadership division within al-Shabaab, so they're less able to focus on the external attacks that we've been most concerned about. So there is that glimmer of good news and a lot of attention being paid to it. On the other side, there's the question like what happens next in Somalia, and it's harder to see a path forward to a really stable, right now, a stable government with the level of security that we would look for. So there's the good news now, and then I think we just have to watch to see what develops there.
Well, you know the Aspen rules. If you let something go more than 60 seconds over time, they do awful things to us. So I want to thank you both for what's been a really great conversation and a really great way to start the day.
Thank you very much. We'll now take a short break and reconvene at 10:15.